Hello, everybody. Welcome to Heart-Like Vedic Astrology. Today I was going to go through analysis, Vedic Astrology Jyotish analysis for the new moon Amavasya that's happening today, March 10th, 2024. And it seems like the overall theme for this moment in time, this new moon, is spiritual gains through restriction. So let's get into it. Note beforehand, though, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. And you might take a minute or two to read the rest of this disclaimer. So if you're new to Vedic astrology, Jyotish, or my videos, all of my teaching videos on the subject are in my concepts playlist. They can all be found there. And wherever you see a double asterisk in one of my talks, that means there's a teaching video on that subject so you can learn more. This is an interpretation video, so I do incorporate a lot of concepts. And so these are some of the videos you might check out in addition to this one to get more out of this talk. So the first is North, South, and East Indian style charts. I do cover Western style charts in that video, but I don't have that listed in the title. Introduction to navigating a birth chart, introduction to the constellations or rashis, constellation or rashi categories, planetary aspects, natural benefic and malefic planets or grahas, planetary directional strength or bala, planetary exaltation and debilitation, karako bhava or planet breaking house, nakshatras or lunar mansions, and then there's some uh, um, yoga, so planetary combinations, parivartana yoga, saraswati yoga, and also pravraja yoga are seen in this chart. And then I also do have a whole playlist on symbolism of each planet, so you can check any of the planets out that are interesting to you or important. And then I have a whole growing playlist of houses and bhavas, so you can check that out as well. And if you're not familiar with the symbolism of each house, then I would start with the first one, the Lugna, Ascendant, Rising Sign, First House, to get you grounded in that information. Okay, so here is the chart for the new moon Amavasya that happened this morning, 10th of March 2024. My time it happened at 5:01 a.m., so before sunrise. The day lord for this moment in time is Saturn, and the hora lord or hour lord is Saturn. So already, just from that, we get restrictions are important. The Dasha period or planetary period was Jupiter, K2, Mars, Sun. So from that, excuse me, of those four planets, Mars and Sun are leadership planets. And K2 is kind of a separatist, kind of release type planet. It also has some spiritual indications. And Jupiter is a planet related to law and spirituality as well, and learning, teaching. So leadership, law, release, learning, all those things are indicated. And then that planetary period is going to shift from Jupiter K2 Mars to Jupiter K2 Rahu on March 13th, so just a few days out. And so already with that, Jupiter K2 and Rahu, again, children is indicated by Jupiter, K2 and Rahu, spirituality, and then you can see the placements here are also related to like the ninth house of spirituality. And then Jupiter can also be related to um, gains as well as charity. So you can start to kind of get a picture of what the energy is here. The Lagna nakshatra is Uttara Ashada, so a powerful victory. And the moon nakshatra or lunar mansion is Purva Bhadrapada. Purva Bhadrapada is, excuse me, symbolized by the front legs of a funeral pyre. So that's a fairly transformative energy at this in this part of the sky. It can be fairly destructive, as you would imagine. Same kind of energy of cremation. The thing though is that part of that, at least in Indian culture, the reason why cremation is done is to help separate the soul from the material world. And so I do think that that's part of what's going on here. And since the moon represents things like the mind, especially the intuitive mind and emotions, again, we're getting at this kind of overriding energy of separation and release. Yeah. The other thing is the context of this. So Ramadan began today, and I don't think that that's just a coincidence. Also, Shivaratri just happened on Friday, and the reason why I think these are important is that with these sorts of religious practices and observances, is that there really is a notable shift in daily habits. For example, Shivaratri, even though there are quite a few holidays in like the Hindu calendar, Shivaratri is a little bit unusual because it's actually celebrated during the night instead of during the day because it's like a nightly vigil of, singing and chanting and things like that. And Ramadan, involves fasting. So even fasting from water typically during the day. And Lent is also happening at this time. So in the Christian Catholic tradition, there's also this sort of, again, restriction being held here. And Saturn, again, the day lord and hour lord, Saturn is also about long-standing traditions. So these are traditions that have been going on for millennia. Yeah. Also, I found out that in the Baha'i tradition, there's a 19-day fast going on. So I don't know if that includes more than like food fasting, but it's also going on. So you can see there are a number of different religious traditions that are more or less simultaneously practicing fasting of some kind. Um, and then Easter and Passover, other big holidays are coming just around the corner. And also today, the daylight savings time. So again, it's this kind of literal, very literal, even if you're not religious or spiritual and you don't practice any of these traditions, on some level, daylight savings is going to most likely affect your life, because just to keep in sync with, kind of everybody else and when to show up to work and when stores are open, that sort of thing. So there literally is, in many ways, a very prominent daily shift. And especially when you get involved with some of these religious traditions of restriction and fasting and things like that. Um, already we've talked about those energies. So keep that in mind as well. Um, there's again this sort of collective energy that's being felt here. So let's start at the top, as I usually do. The top square in the middle, or diamond in the middle, that's the lugna, also known as ascendant, rising sign, first house. And that sets the overall tone for the chart. So the 10, little 10 in the bottom corner of that diamond, that represents the 10th constellation or Rashi of the zodiac, which is Capricorn, also known as Makara in Sanskrit. Okay, so we have a Capricorn rising chart here. Capricorn is a movable earth sign or Chara Prithvi. So it's a very active sign. It's also a very practical, like kind of tangible materials. Somebody with the Capricorn, Lugna, rising sign tends to be very practical in nature and focused on kind of practical, tangible results, material results. Um, so you do have an exalted Mars here. Mars is an interesting energy. So Mars is going to be very strong, and you're going to get the best kind of qualities out of Mars. Mars represents things like leadership, hands-on leadership, especially. It can be forceful. It can be violent at times. It can be erratic at times, but luckily, with it being in Capricorn, that's going to be contained a bit. Mars also happens to be in Dhanistha nakshatra. Dhanistha is symbolized by a drum. So with that nakshatra, you get energies of rhythm. And so, changing daily rhythm, which is these are things we've already talked about just in the context of this new moon. The other thing is that this Mars is being aspected by Ketu. Ketu is currently in Hasta nakshatra. So, so K2 is kind of like Mars. It can be a bit erratic and actually more erratic than Mars because there's actually an additional twist that happens, kind of this sudden, unexpected twist that can happen with K2. And as you can see, K2 and Mars are almost in the same degree. K2 had an exact aspect on Mars just a few days ago, which brought a lot of upheaval and kind of explosive energy. Just to give some examples, this week in my own life, like I had a neighbor who was showing me pictures of his girlfriend's car just suddenly blew up, was set on fire as she was driving it, just randomly. That's very much a Mars K2 energy, especially when this is all K2 and Mars are both in, again, Earth sign. So, tangible things getting blown up. What else happened this week? Oh, different patients that came into my office. So I had one patient who was outward, I mean, obviously from the get-go, I mean, we barely said hello, and he clearly was very agitated and had an expletive-laced history-taking session, and was, quite harsh in his, at least description of other healthcare practitioners he had seen. And again, with all the people I've seen through the many years that I've practiced, his interview was notable in that way. I don't typically get people who are that obviously um, angry and even hostile, I would say. That was his case. And then I had another patient who she came in, she had long COVID essentially. So Mars and K together, like medically, they can indicate things like accidents, injuries, hard to treat infections, that sort of thing. This can also be when you have Mars and K together, because K2 can represent on its own just kind of mental health issues. With Mars there, somebody who's very uh, compulsive and has a hard time controlling themselves. Luckily, though, here, you do have the Lugna Nakshatra and Uttara Ashada, so there's going to be victory here. So that's helpful. The other thing is that the dispositor or ruler of Capricorn is Saturn, and Saturn is in its own house of Aquarius. So that's going to make Saturn stronger. So that's going to help Mars. The thing is, currently Saturn is combust. So that may actually indicate that it's harder to maintain control, or there's an effort to maintain control, but there's some difficulty here. But I think ultimately, deep down, there will be some victories to be had here. The other thing is that Saturn, the dispositor of Mars and the Lugna, is in the nakshatra of Satabhisha. Satabhisha is translates as 100 healers. And so, with Saturn being in that part of the sky, you can get diseases and conditions that are hard to diagnose, hard to treat, and that sort of thing. And with Saturn being in Aquarius, which is a fixed air sign, you can get a lot of things related to like air, vata. If you follow Ayurveda, vata or wind type conditions, so things of the nervous system. Yeah. So with Mars and Ketu here, you can get people who are having um, a lot of hard time controlling themselves, controlling their bodies. Like the person with long COVID who came in, I mean, she can't barely walk like 50 steps before she gets tired. So, and then the thing is, you can see Moon is with this really strong Saturn. So that's Saturn is going to be, it's going to bring anxiety, depression, skepticism, doubt, fear, worry to the moon, which is the mind, especially the emotional mind. And then you have Mercury, which is the rational mind, with Rahu. Rahu is similar to Ketu in many ways. It can indicate mental illness. So you can see there's a lot going on here. And again, if we were reading this as somebody's chart, like more statically, when you have Saturn and Moon so close together here, this is somebody who would be born into Sati, which is a 7.5 year period of Saturn in the sign before, of, and after the moon, which is typically a very difficult emotional time for people. And it's about releasing, letting go, and some people, good things can come out of Sati for sure. But what's sort of common typically with people who go through Sati at different points in their life is that they're losing uh, support systems, typically, long-standing support systems. So already, we haven't gotten too far, but already you can see that there's going to be a lot of mental, emotional stuff going on here. Yeah, so let's see. So if we're putting this all together for the first house, the other thing to note, so there's some strength with Mars, and K2 is in Virgo. Virgo is a dual earth sign, and we have Mercury aspecting into Virgo, which it owns, rules. So that's going to help stabilize K2 a little bit, but the thing is, Mercury is debilitated in Pisces. So how much help Mercury is going to give? Probably better than nothing, but still, Mercury's not in a particularly strong spot itself. Um, but what I could see here is, especially when you have Mercury aspecting its own sign, and especially Virgo, um, y- I can see, I typically see people getting into like cleaning and tidying mode because Mercury is a very detail-oriented planet. And so, since Virgo is a Earth practical sign, you can get people who get into just, like, especially right now, people might be really hardcore getting into like spring cleaning and stuff like that. And that's part of these traditions too, I believe, with Passover. Like, traditionally, people would give away their whole like dish set and stuff like that, and get a new one. As a sign of bringing new things. You know, out with the old and with the new type of energy. Yeah. Yeah. So since Mars and K2 are in the first house represents the body. So this could be cleansing, right? Some kind of spiritual, because K2's in the ninth house of spirituality and religion. Some kind of release and cleansing process of the body and the mind, because the first house also represents mind and psychology. Although I could see where this cleansing process is actually, at least initially, bringing some turbulence. Which, again, if you're fasting, if you're not used to fasting and you're not even drinking water, especially the first few days, if you've ever done a fast, the first few days are usually the hardest, and then you kind of typically lose your appetite after a few days and you kind of don't notice anymore. But the first few days are hardest because you're thirsty, you're hungry and your blood sugar is dropping and you're not getting food on time. And the thing is that, from an Ayurvedic point of view, fasting like that, doing a hardcore fast like that is going to increase vata, which is a wind energy, and wind, can blow high and low and fast and slow. So it's a destabilizing energy. Yeah. Not that it's all bad, but again, we're just seeing those energies play out here in the chart. Okay, so again, if we're, going to bring some, words to this first house here, what are we seeing? Methods and practice of spiritual cleansing for the body, mind, and emotions, deep transformation of self, um, sudden, unusual changes, distance and release, shifting rhythms and habits. Because again, with Mars and Dhanistha, that's rhythm, but when you bring K2 into the mix, Mars is again already erratic, but K2 is going to disrupt that, rhythm, personal rhythm even more. Okay, but there's a spiritual reason, spiritual cause of this. And again, I do think that a lot of good potential is going to come out of here, but the initial kind of physical presentation is not going to be stable. Yeah. And then the Lugnatia is the Swa. So Swa means a planet in its own house, Saturn. So we have a very strong Saturn, except for it's in its own house, so it's strong that way, but it's combust. So again, it's going to be more internal restriction rather than external restriction. So, like for example, with Ramadan, it's not that food is not available or anybody's you know well, maybe religious authorities, are suggesting it or, that sort of thing. And there might be some social pressure, but it's not like potentially food is not available. It's coming more from within in terms of the decision to restrict food and water and that sort of thing. Um, and you can see here that, we have Moon, Saturn, Venus, and Sun all in Saturn, Saturnian sign, and Mars in a Saturnian sign. Um, and Saturn is also aspecting Jupiter. So, We have one, two, three, four, five planets, six planets that Saturn, this massive Saturn, is influencing. The other thing is that Mercury, so the planets that Saturn is not influencing are Mercury, Rahu, and Ketu, but Mercury is on Rahu and Ketu, so I would say this is a Saturn-Mercury dominated chart. Saturn is a planet of distance and isolation, and Mercury can also be a planet of distance and isolation, but more of the mind. So, as we can see things with like fasting and Ramadan and stuff like that, just by the fact of like, not eating, lunch or breakfast or that sort of thing during the day, that's going to disrupt social functions. And that's part of the purpose of it, right? The part of the purpose is like to disrupt the day, disrupt the, daily habits of even eating and drinking, to one, gain more empathy for people who don't have food and water available to them. But then the other thing is, it's also kind of forces one to, if you're not focused on even material needs like eating and drinking, then that kind of forces you in a way to spend your time and energy considering spiritual matters instead of material matters. Okay, so the thing is, this super strong Saturn has gone to the second house, and you can see with this big blue circle that I've created here, this is a point of focus. This is a pravraja yoga, which is a life focus. And so you have Sun, Saturn, Venus, and Moon here. Moon and Saturn are combust. They're very close to Sun, so you can't see them. So you can only see Sun and Venus here. But this gives a life focus of the second house. Second house represents things like family, inner circle, eating, drinking, speech. So the other thing that's typically happening during these religious observances is that there's a lot of praying going on. There's a lot more religious conversation going on, um, uh, going to or listening to or speaking about these traditions and the meaning and significance of them, that sort of thing. Moon and Sun and Purva Bhadrapada. So again, Moon represents the mind, Sun represents the soul and health. And so again, it's in this funeral pyre energy of releasing the soul um, from the material world. The second house can also represent things like savings and movable assets. So it's also a wealth. It's actually called the wealth building house in the Sanskrit. So temporarily release of that, and there again with the Saturn being strong but combust, there's an internal, personal internal restriction of engaging in the usual kind of material focus practices. It's almost a reverse of building wealth because there's also, as typically with Ramadan, there's almsgiving, right? There's charity that's given to poor. So, and then we have Venus here. Venus is a planet that represents things like the finer things in life, like fine food and uh, you know uh, any sort of pleasure, entertainment type thing, fun, frivolity, socializing. So there's going to be a restriction here as well. And Venus in Dhanistha, so again, that drum beat energy. So there's also going to be a disruption to socializing and social activities. Typically, again, people, typically eat before the sun rises and after the sun sets. So there is some socializing, but there's a different rhythm to it than what's normal. Okay, so again, when we're putting all these energies together in the second house, we're seeing a transformation, a release of the mind and the soul, abstinence of all kinds, because Venus represents socializing and, again, fine dining. The moon represents liquids. Sun represents a work career. So this, even though people mostly focus on the food, restriction of food and water, it's going to affect, health. It's going to affect your ability to work. It's going to affect your ability to think, if you're a student, especially with blood sugars going up and down, that sort of thing. Um, so this could also be strict ideology of the family, right? Because we're talking about the second house here, and Saturn being in its own sign of Aquarius, Aquarius being a air sign. those thoughts and ideas. Internal restriction of food, liquids, feelings also, I would say, because Moon and Venus are the two feeling planets, emotion planets. So it's kind of about suppressing how you're feeling physically to maintain a fast. Prayer, again, we talked about speech, health, also compassion, right? Because what we're seeing here, you can't see Saturn and Moon, but outwardly you can see Sun and Venus. So again, Sun is kind of soul, and Venus is compassion, right? Between Venus and Jupiter, the two compassion planets. So it's about reestablishing a greater compassion and empathy for others. That's part of the practice, or reason for the practice. The other thing that's I thought was sort of funny and cute was that the sun here, this moment in time, is 5:01 Eastern Standard Time, and even though the 10th of March, by the material calendar is Sunday, you can see the day lord is Saturday. So, and sun, because it hasn't reached the ascendant time, that means the sun is below the horizon. So this is literally eating before dawn. I was like, oh, that's pretty perfect. Yeah. And then let's see. I think I mentioned most of these other things. So you can see that the second house is essentially the base for the first house because Saturn is ruling both houses here. What other things do I have in the notes? Accidents, injuries, infections. I mentioned that because of the Mars K2 mix in the first house. Also, anger, irritation, kind of like I mentioned that a kind of hostile patient that came in the door this week. Um, that's fairly typical when you get this combination. I think I mentioned also like when we had Mars crossing, literally crossing K2, not just aspecting K2, back in October. That's when Hamas bombed Israel. So if that's another kind of and it was a perfect storm because of the way that Israel's chart is formed. But anyway, on a very grand scale, it's a kind of explosive energy that can happen when you have Mars and K2 paired up in different ways. And also, but the Mars K2 thing, combination here, this would also, again, if this was somebody's chart, this is somebody who would be like a very innovative thinker and a very active pioneer type, like doing things differently. Perhaps not the most steady or stable, but definitely different. Like somebody who just does things differently. And again, it's probably on the better side of things because because Mars is exalted and Saturn is Swa. So there is underlying this instability of Mars and K2. There's some stability here. And then again, we have the Lugna nakshatra of Uttara Ashada, which is a pretty nice, powerful victory energy. So despite the instability here, it looks like good things are coming. I mentioned the pravraja yoga, that combination of planets in the second house. There's also, with Mars being exalted in the first house, that's a Ruchika yoga. That's a Raj yoga, or yoga bringing power. And then I would also say that there's a Kala Sarpa yoga here. You can see that dotted gray line between Rahu and Ketu because there's only one planet on the other side, which is Jupiter. So I would consider that a Kala Sarpa yoga, which is a combination of planets indicating ambition. So with all of this, power, focus, ambition, alternative, mindset, and letting go of a lot of things, releasing things, and doing things in a very different way. So that's just the first and second house. Also to note before I move ahead, the Chidra grahas, so the planets of vulnerability for this chart are Sun and Venus, which are both double Chidra grahas, and Sun and Venus are in the second house. So, again, I think that's indicating that again, this fasting, uh, situation, that can be for some people, that can be a pretty difficult thing to do medically. And I know there are medical exemptions and stuff like that, but still, some people may not realize that they're pre-diabetic or hypoglycemic and things like that, they might be on the early side of that. And so if they fast all day, it could really wear some people out. The other thing is, again, from an Ayurvedic point of view, the different constitution types are able to fast more than others. So, for example, people who are more of a vata constitution or wind constitution, they have the least amount of stamina typically, constitution-wise. So they should potentially only do a light fast, not a complete fast, for a few days. Not to contradict the Ramadan, indications at all. I'm just giving a different perspective medically on, how this is stressful for the body and the mind. You know, um, but again, that's part of the kind of sacrifice aspect of these practices of different traditions, right? And that's why some people have to set them out because it is too much for them. But and then going back to the constitution thing from a Ayurvedic point of view, then Pitta people, the fire people, they have a little bit more stamina. They can fast for a little bit longer. And then the Kapha people, the earth element people, they have the most stamina. So Kapha people have the least amount of disturbance mentally and physically when they do a cleanse, and they're especially when it's a more strict cleanse, like is typically done in Ramadan. But people who have high levels of vata or a strong vata constitution, they will get windier and windier if they do a complete fast, and for the typical 30 days that Ramadan indicates. So anyway, so there is a mental and emotional, physical destabilization that happens, and so this Venus and Sun Chidra business, I don't think this is indicating that this fast is not necessarily an easy one. The other thing is that the two planets symbolize, like Sun, for example, symbolizes career. It symbolizes things like father. It symbolizes things like authority. It symbolizes things like soul. And then Venus symbolizes things like loved ones and relationships. So again, if this was a chart of a person, especially with Venus and Sun being in the second house of family and inner circle, I would think that there's actually a lot of vulnerability with those specific relationships and family in general, especially since this is a life focus. Um, Also, with Saturn being Swa but combust here, there may be a lot of internal kind of filtering or um, kind of absence of speech. So maybe somebody who does not feel entirely comfortable, especially with the Moon Saturn combination, of speaking their mind. So they may hold back a lot of what they're truly thinking, which would, that in and of itself may create a barrier with family members, even though on the surface things might look okay. Um, and then money-wise, Venus is yogi, graha, so that's wealth related planet in the wealth house, and Saturn is Swa there, even though it's combust, that'll still help with wealth. Jupiter's the Avi yogi, so that can indicate some levels of dearth. And then Mars is the duplicate yogi, so that can indicate wealth. So with Mars being in the Lugna, Venus being in the second house, that can indicate wealth. And then Jupiter, even though it's the Avi yogi, that's in the fourth house, so that might be the family line potentially. There might have been some, poverty or lack of wealth, potentially, but you can see Jupiter is in a sign of Mars, and Mars is aspecting Jupiter, so I think Jupiter's covered there. All that Martian, Jupiter swimming, all that Martian energy is going to pull that Jupiter up in terms of the Avi Yogi business. The other thing is you can see Jupiter aspecting the 12th house into its own sign. And when you see Jupiter aspecting the 12th house like that, 12th house is known as the house of losses and expenditures and things like that. But with this, I would see this as being, again, charity, giving of charity. Its 12th house can indicate charity, especially when you have a Jupiter aspecting its own sign like this. So this is the almsgiving, portion of potentially like a Ramadan type fast, beyond the physical food and water fast, the other practices involved in Ramadan, like giving money and food and clothing and stuff like that to people who have less than yourself. So yeah, already a lot. Then the third house here, I've mentioned a little bit. So the third house lord is Jupiter. So again, this Jupiter wrapped in this Martian energy where it's aspected by Ketu. So there's this, and Jupiter's in Bharani nakshatra, which is symbolized by a womb. So it's all about kind of cycles of life and death, and especially with Jupiter being there, it's like a bringing life. And the third house represents things like siblings and neighbors. Mercury is there with Rahu, so this could be like a neighbor, or again, figure a literal neighbor like next down the street, but also just sort of neighbors of the world. Everybody's sort of a neighbor in a way. Um, this could be somebody. The neighbor could be somebody who's struggling because Mercury is there in Purva Bhadrapada, and then Rahu is there. So again, some Mercury's debilitated, so problems of the mind and problems with organization. And so the Jupiter there, with the underlying Martian energy, this is going to bring some, again, charity and relief to the third house. Also shifting mindsets, because again, that's part of like this whole Ramadan significance, right? Is it's all about creating empathy. I mean, if you're used to eating whenever you want, whatever you want, and then, for a month you purposely are restricting yourself, you can see how that fasting affects your ability to think and work. And, especially, when Ramadan happens in the middle of the summer and you live in a hot place, I mean, that can be really hardcore. It's a little different when Ramadan is in the winter and it's the days are short. Yeah. Um, Yeah, so, when you get this combination of the third house and effort, there's Rahu there, so there's an ambition, there's an effort here to shift the mindset regarding feelings towards siblings and neighbors and being more charitable, right? Then the fourth house Lord I mentioned is this exalted Mars into its own sign. That's going to bring strength. Also, Saturn, this massive Saturn is on Jupiter. So again, both of these things, right? The unusual physical practices, the unusual initiatives of this kind of practice, the unusual, um, uh, you know, uh, eating and drinking habits, temporarily. These are all ways of essentially generating karma. That's another way of looking at this. Um, they may not use the words or the terminology in the same way, but it's kind of, again, it's always interesting to me that essentially all these different religious traditions have essentially the same practice. There are different variations of how they express it and how they practice it, but it seems to me like they all recognize the importance of generating karma, better karma, um, by, abstinence of some kind. Yeah. And so with this exalted Mars aspecting um, the fourth house, again, the fourth house represents things like happiness, education, family line. So again, we're bringing family back into this. And with Mars and Saturn here, when you have Mars and Saturn combination, you can get things like workaholism, athleticism, um, engineering, that sort of thing. So there's a very strong effort here, to build karma, for the whole family, to support religious practices or spiritual practices. You could see it that way if you don't want to think about it from a karma perspective. Um, and then I mentioned this Jupiter aspect into its own sign in the 12th house. So that's, practice of charity as well. Um, and then And then again, this Jupiter is also aspecting, and you can see a lot of planets are aspecting the eighth house of deep psychology. So, I mean, it's a different thing to do a fast for like a day or a weekend or something, or even a week. But when you do practices for longer, like when you do, like in the whatever, a lot of Indian traditions, they'll do like mantra practice 40 days. You can see that like 30, 40 days mark when you do things, when you change your habits for that long, you have more, I think, of a chance of making it stick. So it becomes like not just a practice, but a new, habit or lifestyle. And that's, would be ideal, I think, from a lot of religious perspectives. Yeah, so you can see again, fourth house, family involvement, but this is great in terms of spirituality. And yeah, so then the fifth house here, the Lord is Venus and Dhanistha, aspected by Ketu. So Venus is a practical advisor, and Ketu is going to be again about practical advice about doing this spiritual religious cleansing, and this would also potentially get the children involved because also Jupiter and the fourth house again the fourth house is related to education, especially like high school, college level education, and Jupiter represents children and teacher. So I think this is also this practice, if you have children or around children, is also um, passing down traditions. They're important spiritual traditions, uh, and advising people practically about how to do these cleansing and fasting practices. And then you have the sixth house here. The sixth house lord is Mercury. So the sixth house is daily habits. So we've been talking about that already. And you can see Mercury's debilitated and it's on the Rahu Ketu axis. You can see the moon. Actually, the moon moves so fast. You actually have moon on the Rahu Ketu axis for the next few days. So again, there's going to be some shifting of the mind and emotions here. Again, because the first few days of a fast are usually the hardest, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Uh, so yeah, we're just getting more of the same. Switching up daily habits here. And then, oh, and that can also represent, because the sixth house also represents the fifth house is kind of upper GI, and the sixth house is kind of mid GI. So people could be having some, GI issues and stuff like that. Actually, that's another patient I had last few days was a kind of an urgent care case, a woman who was having abdominal pain, and she's somebody who has a phobia of vomiting. So she also had anxiety. So you could see how these sorts of planets and stuff is driving that up for her. And these placements is driving that up for her. Yeah, so again, this is the feeling hungry, the first few days of the fast. Um, and trying to establish new rhythms without eating and drinking. That's a disturbance, right? And then the seventh house here, the Lord of the seventh house is a new moon. And again, it's with this really strong Saturn. So the moon is going to be, I think, not very stable or solid at the moment. And then we have this Mars aspecting into Cancer here, and Mars is debilitated. So I think the seventh house, there's going to be quite a bit of rock and roll going on here. So this may mean for some people that there's relationship issues going on. This could even mean like because K2 is on Mars, this could even mean like arguments with partner or separation with partner. The seventh house also indicates independent business. So I would see like disruption of relationship and business rhythms here. And part of that too may be because I didn't mention Venus also can represent things like sex, and Mars can represent things like libido. So especially like with Ramadan and stuff, not only are you fasting from like food and water, but you know, sex during the day. So that might bring up some issues potentially. And you can see again all these planets aspecting the eighth house here. Moon, Saturn, Sun, Venus aspecting the eighth house. You also have Jupiter and Mars here. So just as much energy, if not more, is almost all the energy on the second in the second house and the eighth house. The eighth house can also represent things like sexual relations. So there's that kind of restriction as well potentially, um, and that may make things better or worse for relationships. depending on what people are used to and what kind of significance they bring to sex and sexual relations. And if they're able to abstain or not, some people really have that's worse, I think even the Buddha said that, right? Isn't there some quote like, um, if there was anything, if there was anything in the world as powerful as sex, the Buddha said he didn't think he would become a monk, because he had to give that up. So, it says a lot, right? If even the Buddha is talking about how the power of sex, right? So, what else is going on here? Uh, yeah, 10th house. Why did I put the 10th house? I think I put it on the wrong line, but I had the right information. So the Saturn, Mars on Jupiter business and Jupiter aspecting the 10th house, that's going to affect that's going to bring spirituality to like a daytime practice because the 10th house is literally like high noon, like the activities of your daily life. And so all these changes, uh, practical spiritual changes that are happening with fasting and stuff like that, um, are going to be more obvious because people are going to be skipping lunch, or they're not going to be meeting with people during lunch, because typically, it's at least in some cultures, if somebody's fasting religiously, it's rude to eat or drink in front of them. Yeah. So um let's see, the eighth house, I pretty much, it's you've there's going to be some strength here because Sun is aspecting its own house, but you do have, what is it, one, two, three, four, five, six planets aspecting the eighth house. So it's basically the second house, similar indications, but more sexual. Uh, yeah. And then the ninth house, I've already sort of talked about. You've got K2 and Hasta with aspected by Mercury, which will help a little bit, except the Mercury is debilitated. So, and this ninth house is related to authority and religious community, spiritual community, even governments and stuff like that. So, this could be again cleansing, meditative practice, spiritual community, releasing the material mindset, removing, shifting daily habits to again bring empathy. And again, even government holidays, right? In some areas of the world, depending on which of these, or even like universities and stuff like that, who have students of all faiths, walking around. Um, they'll put out lists of, um, religious holidays so that teachers and stuff like that can make accommodations for those students. So you can see all that in the ninth house. Um, and just this general idea of release and let go, to bring about better energy and bring one closer to God instead of being so focused on the material world, right? The 10th house I already mentioned, spiritual work restrictions here because of Jupiter under the influence of a massive Saturn and massive Mars aspecting into the 10th house of daily activities, uh, release activities during daylight rather than habits, which is the 6th house. The 11th house here, the 11th lord is exalted Mars, and you have an aspect by Saturn here. So there can be the practices are also going to influence like income in groups, right? Socializing. So we have Venus, the planet of socializing, and Moon, the planet of the public, sitting in this massive Saturnian Aquarius house. So there are going to be restrictions there as well. Because again, a lot of, socializing involves eating and drinking and, that sort of thing. So it's also going to affect socializing because typically during Ramadan, you eat before the sun sets and after the sun, before the sun rises and after the sun sets, typically with your closer family and friends, rather than just out and about, with your photography group or whatever, and other kind of more peripheral social groups you engage with. And then what else? That's also going to affect income potentially because, again, if you're giving part of your income away as part of your spiritual practice. And then the 12th house, I already mentioned, philosophy, charity, goodwill, when you have this Jupiter aspecting its own house, Sagittarius in the 12th. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of funny. You just kind of got the same thing over and over again in different variations with this chart. But let's get into the amshas, the subzodiacs, to see if we can get any more detail here. Okay, so let's start with the relationships. So just as a reminder, the Dasha period of the new moon was Jupiter, Ketu, Mars, Sun. And that's going to shift to Jupiter, Ketu, Rahu in a few days, March 13th. So what I've done here is I circled those planets because, again, when we're looking at the amshas are mostly related to time, although you can get some additional detail to weave into the birth chart, the natal chart. But you don't typically read the amshas by themselves. So you can see here all of the planets. The first chart at the top is the Navamsha D9. So this is the subchart for spouse, and it's also a general chart for the natal chart. And then the second chart here is the Drakana D3 for siblings. Okay. Now you can see in the Navamsha, Rahu, Jupiter, and Ketu. And Jupiter and Ketu, remember Jupiter and Ketu are the longest Dasha periods here. These are all in negative houses, not well placed. But you can see here that Ketu and Rahu are on the 6-12 axis. So again, daily habits and loss. And you can see Rahu is here in the 12th house. So there's an ambition to a drive potentially for loss or retreat. So again, there's a drive for, and you have Jupiter aspecting this Rahu. So what I see here is charity, right? Going into this mode for charity's sake. But the thing is that in life, right, there's still going to be this Jupiter K2 energy playing out for quite a while. I think in the chart, if I remember correctly, Jupiter K2 shifts to Jupiter Venus in September. So, this could be a generally hard period. And again, this is the amsha for, spouse or spouse-like partner, independent business. So, and it was pretty hardcore, right? Because the moon was new and sitting there with Saturn and Satabhisha, and Mars is debilitated. So it could mean that there's 6 months or so of trouble potentially for, again, if this was somebody's chart, not for everybody. But at the moment, it looks like, uh, as in the natal chart, is that the spousal partnership energy is also challenged. Yeah. But you could see, I didn't circle Venus, but Venus is much better placed than like K2. So, again, but Jupiter's still going to be in the 6th house. But the thing too is that Jupiter is aspecting, you can see the 2nd house here, into its own sign, and Saturn again is in the 2nd house. So again, I think that what this could indicate is that even if it's not a specific intention for any kind of spiritual practices, whether one is following Ramadan or some other religious tradition, but it seems like spirituality will help hold family together potentially uh, to some degree. But again, everybody's going to be running different planets at different times, and you have to incorporate your own natal chart. But there is some challenge here. The other thing is that Mars is in the 7th house. So, which would reflect, this is like partner with partner. So again, it's almost like that Mars that's in the lugna of the natal chart. So there's some, deviation here, and again, it's on the 1-7 axis, so there could be some arguments or separation if this was a couple. K2 in the 6th house, unusual daily habits. So again, maybe coordinating something like Ramadan is creating more stress for a couple. Maybe Jupiter. Yeah, I mean, it gave me some hope, this Jupiter aspecting its own sign of the 2nd house with Saturn. Even though Saturn's going to bring some obstacles and delays, this Jupiter there um, at least the partner with Jupiter in the eighth house, at least that's deep psychology, at least the partner's thinking um, potentially more um, positively, although you will have the Saturn aspect in there as well. But I think the partner is really focused on spirituality and religion at the moment. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes people can get so sucked into it that they completely lose sight of the material world, including their partner. That's a possibility. But if this person is, I think, properly engaged in those practices, they can help overcome difficulties in a relationship. So, um, but with the Jupiter and Saturn here on the 2-8 axis, this is like a long-term building, spiritual food, speech, family, generosity. I think this person's trying the partner here, even though it's difficult. So again, it might be that not only the natal chart person, because whenever you look at a relationship issue with the Jyotish, it's great if you can look at both charts. Because the thing is, sometimes the problems come up in a chart not because of, you won't see them necessarily always come up so strongly in one chart because that person's actually running good planets, or positive planets for them. But it might be in the other person's chart that's really like just getting trashed at the moment. And because you're now like sort of a player on their, like a chessboard, their chessboard or their chart, their planetary periods are kind of spilling over into your experience. So it's all happy, happy, good stuff when both people are going through positive planets and they have generally positive placements. But then if one person's chart goes kaput for temporarily, then it can be havoc for both, right? So anyway. Then what else do we have? Oh, we have Sun in the fourth house with Moon aspected by Venus, and Jupiter's on there again. So, I mean, that's the family, right? So, mother, father, spouse, children in the fourth house, and Moon is exalted there. Venus is going to be swa there. So, that's a lot of actually positive energy in home and lineage, soul, education, all the things that we saw in the natal chart. And then, as I mentioned, Mars is on the 1-7 axis again. So again, this might be anger, harsh words because you have Mars with Mercury here. Arguments typically, or decisions to separate. That's a possibility. Then the second chart here is this is Drake and a D3 of siblings. You have a Vargotama Lugna, so you have the same rising sign as the natal chart, so that makes it important amsa subchart. Jupiter's not well placed again. That's the thing, though, is like what's watch Jupiter through the amshas, and I think you'll start to see what I see. So Jupiter's not well placed, and again, the siblings chart. We have Mercury. So again, this is the same lugna as the natal chart. We have Mercury again in the third house. We have Mars on Mercury. We have Mars and Jupiter aspecting the fourth house again. We have Venus in the second house. So there is actually a lot of recreation, of the natal chart here and the siblings, which again, the siblings, you could also again see that as like neighbors or kind of siblings is kind of people who are on your level, not people who are like above you, like an authority, or people below you, like servants, where there's like a power dynamic or something like that, but people who are on your same plane. Yeah, what did I write here? Jupiter's not well placed. Yes, we know. Third Lord. Okay, so yeah, but the Jupiter is in the eighth house of deep psychology, which is since Jupiter is the Lord of the third house, this is like rethinking siblings and neighbors, which is similar to the natal chart, right? It's like how do we create more empathy for the people around us rather than just becoming numb to their situation or their plight or whatever, because we can all end up there, pretty easily. But there's a lot of similarities. So Mercury's in the third house, Mars and Jupiter plus the Sun, um, aspecting the fourth house. So a lot of leadership energy, spiritual leadership energy here with siblings. Mercury and Mars in the ninth house. It's almost like Mercury and Ketu in the ninth house. So again, innovation, spiritual innovation here. Venus and Jupiter in the second house. So that's going to be a lot of, you know, compassion and spirituality related to the second house. Again, family, food, speech. Saturn is in the sixth house, so disrupting daily habits and slowing them down. So you can see that the D3 is very similar to the natal chart. We have the Saptamsha D7 for children and Dwadashamsha D12 for parents, grandparents. These are looking pretty good. Mars is not well placed. It's in the sixth house, but it is exalted, so that means it's going to improve with time. So I'm not too worried about that. Plus, Mars is a fairly short blip here since the Dasha period's shifting in 3 days, and Mars is a very small Uttara subperiod here. But you can see this D7 is very important, and we know that because you have so many planets aspecting the Lugna. I mean, you've got Ketu, Sun, Jupiter, Moon. That's already 4 planets. Then you have Venus and Mars aspecting. So you have 6 planets aspecting the first house. So this is an important thing. And you can see here. See, again, you have Mercury in the third house. So rethinking neighbors, and siblings. But Sun is Swa in the Lugna here. So leadership, soul, Jupiter's are teaching, children, education, Ketu, Rahu, doing things differently, alternative thoughts, and then Mars there. So Mars is going to be a bit disruptive to daily habits, but again, you're going to have the 2 leadership planets, Mars and Sun, together in the Lugna here. So it's all about like leading, children through kind of alternative actions and mindsets, and to build compassion for others. So it's a big teaching moment, for the children. Yeah, and it's very strong to the whole chart, the amsa here. Thunder Dwadashamsa, all the grahas are well placed, which you probably, if this is a tradition handed down through parents and grandparents, then parents and grandparents usually are all on board for this, which is what we see here. Mars is Swa with Jupiter in the ninth house, so that's going to be some transformative spirituality. Um, Mars is aspecting Ketu, so we've got that in the fourth house of family line. So, um, alternative, family practices. It could also be disruption of the family line, like maybe the parents and grandparents, especially, God, there's so many incidences in history of people not being allowed to practice their faith, and that being squelched by society or government or what have you, or other faiths. And so maybe in the past, this, again, if this was a particular family in the family, maybe they weren't allowed to practice openly their faith. And so they're very happy to do so openly now because they didn't have that opportunity before. We do have Mercury again in the third house. So rethinking neighbors, siblings, it's pretty consistent. And what else do we have? Oh, we have, here's where we start. So you can see Jupiter's in the Lugna with children, Amsha. And we have Jupiter aspecting its own sign with Venus, which is exalted in this Amsha. I mean, parents and grandparents are pretty ecstatic, I think, at this particular moment. But a lot of strong compassion and spirituality, I would think, coming through the family line here. Maybe because, again, in the past, there was some suppression of their ability to express and observe their spiritual faith, their religious faith, yeah. So children and grandparents, parents are all doing pretty well with this here. Then education and career. So the first chart's Siddhamsha D24 education. The second one's Dashamsha D10 career. Sun, Ketu, Rahu are not well placed. But the thing is, Sun is exalted, so that will get better. And again, the Sun's a blip here. It's a very fast Antara. But this is also important. You can see again, 5 grahas related to Lugna. We have Jupiter, Mercury, Venus. There's a parivartana between Mars and Jupiter that brings Mars in there, and then Saturn is aspecting. And then the thing is, Jupiter and Mercury have bala, directional strength, in the Lugna, and those are the 2 education planets, student and teacher. And you have Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, which is Saraswati yoga in the Lugna. So that's a planetary combination for education, arts, learning. So very strong D24 here. This I'm not too worried because again, the Jupiter's in the Lugna, and then it's going back to the 5th house here with the part of exchange of houses with Mars. K2 Rahu in the 3rd house again, changing. Um, I say like changing or thoughts or changing attitudes about neighbors and siblings, that sort of thing. So it's a very strong transformational learning moment because again, the Lugna here is Scorpio. Scorpios are all about transformation. Um, the other thing is when you have Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury aspect in the 7th house. Again, I think that the spiritual effort here is going to bring positive things to family, but again, spouse as well. That's the thing, though, is that when we talk about karma, the karma, some karmas, they just, it's immediate. You do a good deed, and then like almost like the next second, somebody does a good deed for you. But sometimes there's a time delay, and so you won't necessarily see all the fruits of the actions here immediately. But it does seem like spiritual practice will eventually help bring good karma to relationships and independent business. Um, then the D10, Mars and Ketu are not well placed, but they're on the shorter side of the Antara subperiods here. But you can see again, Mars is aspecting K2, so there's a disruption of actions for siblings and neighbors. So you can see the 3rd house keeps, gets getting churned up. Mars is aspect its own sign of the 2nd house, so it's going to make the 2nd house strong yet again. Rahu and Ketu are on the 3-9 axis again, so you can see that there's some similarities to the natal chart. Jupiter and Venus are in parivartana now, so you're going to bring more of this benefic. They're both benefic planets. You're going to bring those benefic planets, more of that energy all over the chart. So again, what I was saying here is that again, the spiritual efforts that are being put in today, because again, if we're shifting to Jupiter Venus period, and like if this was a person, they're shifting to Jupiter Venus in September. This career chart's going to light up like a Christmas tree. So there may be a time delay in terms of the good karma that's being produced by observing these religious traditions. Um, but there may be a temporary loss of communication and neighbors, coworkers, because you do have Mars aspecting K2 in the 3rd house, which, again, if you're following something like Ramadan, you're going to be socializing more with your very close friends and family more than the more peripheral people in your life. So that makes sense. Then looking at income and assets. The first chart here is Ekadamsha, the D11 for income. The second one is Chaturtamsha, D4 for assets. And you can see, again, just the blip here. Mars and Sun are not well placed, but they are with a Swan moon, so things will get better. But there's actually a leadership of changing daily habits. And I think this gets back to, you can see Jupiter aspecting from the Jupiter's in the 9th house with an exalted Saturn in the 9th house of religion. It's aspecting the Lugna. So again, now we're starting to you're going to see Jupiter over and over again related to the Lugnas here. So again, all of this, and since we're in a Jupiter Mahadasha, all of this spiritual effort is actually going to bear quite a bit of fruit, and you can see in different parts of somebody's life. But this Mars and Sun, this Mars is debilitated in Cancer, so this disruption, um, but it's a leadership. It's like done on with purpose. This disruption of daily habits with income. This is, essentially giving income away. Alms, charity, that sort of thing. And then Moon is Swa there, so there's a very clear mental and emotional decision to release income for the betterment of others. And there's also, another parivartana between Venus and Jupiter. So guess what that means? Like when we get to Venus and Jupiter in September, that Mahadasha, the second house is going to light up pretty strongly there through the spiritual effort. So income, there might be a little temporary glitch here, but I think it's intended, it's purposeful, and there will, potentially the more money that's released, the more that will come back. So I think people are aware of that. Um, Not that that's necessarily the reason why people are letting things go, but that's typically what happens when people are very pure-hearted about their charity giving, rather than like potentially promoting their own name or something like that. Anyway, and then there's Chatra Tamsha D4 assets. So we have a Vargodama Lugna, an important Lugna here, same rising sign as the natal chart. Rahu and Ketu are not well placed, but again, we have Rahu in the ninth house of separation, isolated places, uh, like temples, like moss, that sort of thing. Um, Isolation, retreat, meditation, you can see that there too. And shifting daily habits again. Um, and you can see that quite a bit of this chart is recreated. We have Mercury again in the third house, keeps coming up. Mars is aspecting the Lugna, so you have Mars in the first house, that energy there. You have Jupiter and Mars in the fourth house, and that's aspected. Let me just double check on there. I need to change my notes, but no, you have Jupiter and Mars in the fourth house again, like the natal chart, and you have Venus and Saturn in the second house again. So you have Saturn swan with Venus again. Mercury's aspecting its own sign of the ninth house. And yeah, so you can see quite a bit's the same. So assets, what is this? It's giving stuff away. And the other thing is that you can see that giving stuff away, once again, once you get a switch to the Jupiter Venus period, everything you give away, it's like the coffers are going to be refilled pretty quickly, probably within a few months. So, yeah, yeah, you can see it's people are very aware of the interconnection of giving and receiving, and the law of circulation and things like that here. Okay, so then we have the three health amshas. So the first one at the top is the Tajik Shashtamsha D6 for acute illness. Then you have the Tajik Ashtamsha D8 for chronic illness. And then the Bamsha D27 for strength. Now, first thing, if you notice in all three of these, you have Jupiter aspecting the Lugna of all three charts. So that's a good sign for health generally. And again, in the natal chart, um, we had in the Lugna exalted Mars, even though it was aspected by Ketu, the rising sign nakshatra was Uttara Ashada. So there's victory, even if there's a accident, illness, mentally, physically, that sort of thing. It looks like it's going to be worked through, and that's again what we're mostly seeing here in the health charts. You can see in the first one here, all grahas are well placed, and Jupiter's aspecting Lugna, so acute illness. Again, if this was a person's chart, I wouldn't be expecting much here. Although Venus is in the sixth house, we're not running Venus, but that may be when you get to Jupiter Venus, like in September or whatever. then there could be, some issues there potentially, or at least trying to, like you see that trying to, maybe that's the time when there's kind of more of a fixing energy again, if there's a separation with a couple or something like that. Then the D8s, all the planets except Mars are well placed, but Mars is again, it's in the sixth house again of daily habits and, food, nutrition, and digestion. So again, this is just a blip in the first few days here, of, adjusting, I think, to potential fast. And also Mars is aspecting the Lugna here. So it's going to just jostle the health a little bit. I don't think be too serious. Also, you have Saturn aspecting at Mars. Saturn's going to be exalted there, and Mars is aspecting its own sign in the 12th house. So even though there are some disturbances in the 6-12 axis, there's some strength there as well. Let's see. Oh, and you do have Moon, Sun, and Saturn again in the second house, like in the natal chart. So, we're only running, they're only running Sun temporarily, but, some shifts and changes with food, um, family, potentially. Then the Bombsha, you could see they're all well placed. Jupiter's aspecting its own sign in the Lugna. And that's the thing, again, if this is somebody's chart, this is somebody who, even if they do get sick on occasion, they're going to have the strength to pull through. So even if, like the person has a Mars aspected by K2, it's exalted in the first house, and you have Uttara Ashada. Like there's indications that even if somebody experienced something like an accident or illness, that they would, potentially recover. And again, you could see like mental health issues potentially for that person because they were going through Sati and Mercury was on the Rahu Ketu axis. So that could be a lot of compulsive energy, impulsive compulsive energy because Mercury is debilitated. It could also, but that could also indicate like maybe uh, somebody who ends up involved in things like nutrition or sports medicine potentially. I mean, I didn't put it all together, but there's some possibilities there where the things that they experience move them in the direction of becoming like some sort of healer because again, you have all those planets related to Saturn, which is in Satabhisha, which is a healthcare related, nakshatra. Anyway, so you can see that overall, though, this person, almost regardless of whatever period of life they're going through or what they experience, they're going to have quite a bit of strength. And especially through the Jupiter period, you have Jupiter aspecting the Lugna. And the other thing is Jupiter's in the ninth house. So I think spirituality is one of the things that keeps this person strong. So again, if it was a person we were looking at. Then the last two here, we have the Tajik Panchamsha D5, innate spirituality, which is again another Virgotama Lugna, so it's important. And then we have the Vimshamsha D20 for more formal religious worship and stuff like that. So already just the D5 is spirituality. It's not too surprising that at least one of these were for Virgotama. The only planet that's not well placed is K2, and it's in the eighth house of deep psychology and it's with Saturn. So again, that's part of why, a practice like Ramadan is so long is because we don't want just like a band-aid. We are actually trying to more deeply shift somebody's, level of compassion for people, right? That doesn't usually happen overnight. Sometimes, but sometimes if it happens fast, it's like hard and deep, or like, it's something tragic happens, which is not fun, right? Um, rather than voluntarily deciding to practice to become more spiritual. But the Saturn is aspecting its own house in the second house. Rahu is Swa in the second house. So, strong second house there. In terms of unusual practices, food, almsgiving, that sort of thing. Um, Jupiter again is aspecting the lugna. So I counted by this time of the 13 amshas that I went through, 9 out of 13 of them have Jupiter related to either in the lugna or aspecting the lugna of the amshas. So this is a very important spiritual period, again, if this is a person. But just as a moment in time, you can see that the spirituality that's being practiced is going to affect over time almost every aspect of this person's life, if it was a person. There are deep repercussions karmically, essentially. That's another way of putting it on every level for somebody who's doing a deep practice like this. Um, Jupiter's aspecting its own sign in the third house of neighbors, charity to neighbors. We can get there. Um, what else do I have here? Mars is aspecting its own sign in the 11th house. So again, money is going to be good. Even if there's going to be a material return, even if charity is given and fasting is done, all this kind of stuff. There's going to be material rewards coming back from the material abstinence. And again, innate spirituality is just kind of more of an intuitive type of religious or spiritual practice. It's more personal. Then the D20, this is more about kind of more formal group related, institutional related worship. And you can see here, Mars is not well placed, but everything else is. And Mars, again, is a short blip. Mars is in the third house, forming a karako bhava nasha, which indicates problems with siblings and neighbors, potentially. So we get that again. Um, so the lugna here, the lugnatia's moon is exalted in the 11th house. So there's going to be a lot of intelligence plus emotions here. We do get recreation of Saturn and Venus in the second house, as well as Jupiter. Jupiter and Venus are Virgotama, so those are strong positions for the benefic planets. Jupiter is aspected by Mars, so again, you get this Mars Jupiter combination. Jupiter's swimming in this Martian energy. So again, you can see the spirituality related to eating, drinking, and problems with neighbors and things. Neighbors who are having troubles, difficulties. The ninth lord is this Jupiter, who's swimming in this Martian energy. Um, and you can see Jupiter is again in the 10th house of, activities during daylight hours. So there's an obvious demonstration of spirituality during this time. Uh, What else? Rahu and Ketu are exalted in the 5th house with Saturn. So there's like old kind of, so even though they're traditional nowadays, they're probably less so. Different ways of kind of turning things on their head, right? Turning daily practices on their head to develop spirituality, developing new habits and stuff like that, and advice along this way. Because again, the 5th house lord of advice is this Mars in the 3rd house. So, how do we develop more compassion for neighbors? So, again, it's all kind of the same thing from the natal chart. Um, and then there's a lot of, let's say, learning to be had from restricting food and speech and wealth. Because Jupiter is on second house of food, speech, wealth, and Jupiter is also on it's aspecting its own sign in the 6th house of daily habits, and Mercury's there. So we have the two education planets in the 6th house. Um, so yeah, so again, there's a lot of learning, which is the again the intention of something like practicing Ramadan, or again these other faiths that have somewhat similar practices, Lent or the 19-day fast and that sort of thing. Um, yeah, so even though there's temporary Mm. Maybe just adjusting to the making adjustments due to the spiritual practices that a lot of good is going to come from it in the end. Okay, so there you go. The new moon happening today, March 10th. As always, I want to thank you for your time, stopping by and listening to one of my talks, and also all the other support that you give the channel and my work. So, the lovely comments that you leave and the shares and the likes and the subscribes and all that. So, I appreciate all of that. So, thank you and the different ways that you support me and the channel. Again, all of my teaching videos on the subject of Vedic astrology are my concepts playlist. They can all be found there. If you are interested in individual Bart chart reading, I do those on Zoom. You can email heartlightastro@yahoo.com for more info. Although I don't typically do those during eclipse season because the energy is too chaotic. So if you're interested in a birth chart reading, probably at this time I would schedule them after the next or the second eclipse happening at the beginning of April. But anyway, at least you can get some information about it. And then I have another YouTube channel on natural medicine that includes other Vedic arts such as Ayurveda and yoga. And then I include other information from different paradigms of medicine like homeopathy, naturopathic medicine. So the name of that channel is called Nature Source Care, if that's interesting to you also. So as always, thank you for your time. And I hope you found this interesting, useful, and helpful as you navigate the energy cycles of your own life. So until the next one, take care. Namaste.